Good morning. This is Jason D coming at you from Film Fanatic headquarters. It's Sunday morning around 9:15. Hope everyone's doing good. We just had our first snowy, well, I guess you can consider it snowstorm. We didn't get a whole lot of snow, but I guess the driving and whatnot was pretty bad. Probably a good call to stay in, but anyway, I want to thank everyone for their support. Again, for checking out this channel. It's been great seeing it grow week by week, day by day. I want to thank everyone who I know personally and people that I've met online that have been supportive of this channel. There's been a few guys and a few folks in particular that I've met that have been really, really cool and supportive, that also do some YouTube explorations. So I really appreciate that. So today's going to be about this documentary I just saw. I haven't really done too many coverage. I haven't done too many videos of any documentaries. I'm a huge fan of documentaries. I've gone through periods. I have a pretty decent collection when it comes to documentaries here at the Film Fanatic headquarters. I I went through a phase about 4 or 5 years ago. I'd always liked documentaries, but I went through a phase about 4 or 5 years ago where I was really, really into checking out all things that were, related to the documentary world. I had always, like I said, I always had an interest, but there was a whole slew for a few years where a whole incredible list of films that had come out. I used to go to the Camden Film Festival here, and it was originally, it started about maybe 10 or 12 years ago, which is hard to believe. It was this, it's a local film festival that specializes in documentaries. And I used to go to it every year, and it specializes in documentaries. And I used to go to it, and I used to stay up on all the newer documentaries that were coming out, and to see that festival where it's grown now to where it's, in a lot of ways, it's kind of regarded as one of the most popular film festivals. They also show like shorts, and they also have a part of the festival where people can submit their own like personal work, which is really cool. But the specialty or the main kind of attraction or focus of that festival is just documentaries, and they cover everything from a lot of political oriented kind of things, a lot of social things. There's portraits of certain artists, and they also show. There's also, I mean, part of the magic of documentaries is that obviously it's a real life setting. It's the format is to kind of give you a window into reality in regards to maybe a certain subject, and it's become a huge multi-dimensional genre the last few years. It's really taken on new heights, and especially now with technology, where filmmakers can really explore, you know, various ways and also really creative ways to explore the narrative of what a documentary can be. What I've seen too in the last few years, that documentaries have kind of taken on the shape of even more of a cinematic quality. I remember originally, like documentaries, when I first started watching them years ago, it was generally the narrative was about maybe a particular subject where there was an interview forum kind of set that would set everything up, and they would interview various people in that respective related to that subject. And usually, the to a degree, a lot of documentaries were a little bit more on the dry side, and they had a little bit of a less kind of cinematic flair than I think they than than to where I think it's evolved now. Where what I've seen now with documentaries is there are a lot of filmmakers that are kind of blurring the line, I think, creatively, where they're taking that cinematic experience when you see, say, a nonfiction film or a full length film for that matter, where you have elements of where there's a real visual sense, there's the use of music, then the narrative structure of films, and they've taken certain aesthetics from traditional films and incorporated it into documentaries. So on a lot of levels, I feel, aside from what the subject matter is, I think the way that filmmakers now have adapted, by becoming even more creative and almost blurring the lines, even though those movies or those films that are known as documentaries are still steeped in exploring specific subject matter or certain characters that are usually set in reality. They've taken a lot of creative license and have incorporated influences from various other from various filmmakers. So it makes I feel in some ways it makes the experience of seeing documentaries almost a little bit more, gives you a little bit more of an entertainment, has a little bit more of an entertainment value, while also tackling sometimes tough subjects or taboo subjects that are not easily ingested or that are not ever explored. And I think it's a really great culmination of both of those styles. I think too, if people are not maybe keen to seeing documentaries, it almost makes things to some way, in some ways, makes it easier to kind of digest to a degree. If you grew up watching, say, traditional films, fiction or nonfiction, and you've never seen a documentary, I think now to get into that particular genre, it almost is easier because it blurs that line between a real cinematic experience and seeing something that has, to a degree, a cold, hard look at reality in its respected format. So, over the years, I've been buying a lot. There used to be a really great shop in Camden, Maine called Harbor Auto Video, and I used to go there all the time. They closed probably about 5 or 6 years ago. One of the things that they had two areas where two genres of films that was the reason I used to always go there. They had a lot of new releases and whatnot, and a pretty good DVD collection, and they actually had a pretty good horror selection. But their specialty always seemed to be around documentaries and foreign films. They had an amazing assortment in those two respective genres. So that was one of the times I remember when I had a membership there. I used to go there, and I used to get a lot of documentaries, and I got to see lots of wonderful docs that really kind of blew me away. And they closed, unfortunately, about 5 or 6 years ago, and they were selling basically everything that they had in their shop. And I remember buying a ton of documentaries, so I accumulated a pretty good collection of docs over the years, and it was mainly through that shop after they had unfortunately closed. And there was, it was a going out of business sale, so I, really, beefed up my collection. Probably my favorite documentary director is Alex Gibney. He's just incredible. I mean, he's done such a wide range of subjects where, he did a film that tackled, subjects like Scientology, subjects like the big corporate entity that once was Enron, and also America's use of torture during shortly after 9/11, Taxi to the Dark Side. He also did a fabulous movie about Hunter S. Thompson, Fela Kuti, the amazing artist that he was, James Brown. He's done many different genres. He's definitely my favorite director in that respected field. I had the chance to meet him once too, and it was pretty cool. I had gone with some friends, and this was a few years back, to go see one of his movies, and I didn't know it was directed by him. A friend of mine had contacted me about going to see this documentary that was about Fela Kuti, and I really really love his music. The famous Nigerian Afropop star. And it was at the Strand, and we went to the Strand, which is a beautiful theater in Rockland. And when I got to the theater, I went into it pretty cold. I didn't know anything about it. And when I got to the theater, I realized, oh wait, this is an Alex Gibney film, and I was like, wow, like that's awesome. And then the next thing I saw was that he was going to be there, and he was going to be doing a Q&A, and I was just like, this is amazing. Like I had no idea, and the tickets were really cheap. So we went to the movie, and it was just incredible, just an amazing movie. And then Alex Gibney came out, and I had been a fan of his for quite a few years at that point. Alex Gibney came out and did a whole big Q&A and presentation, and it was so awesome. And it was such a great interview, and he just gave so many great insights into his career and his filmmaking. I kind of feel like, even though stylistically it's different, but I put him on that same kind of level. I kind of look at him as being like a Martin Scorsese or like a Stanley Kubrick, but for documentaries. I just think he's like incredible, like just the best. And there's so many great directors in that genre, but for me, he's the best. And he's won a bunch of Academy Awards. He won the best doc for Taxi to the Dark Side, which was about Guantanamo Bay. Just amazing. And I remember afterwards, after the film and the Q&A was done, the couple of friends I was with, we went across the street to actually Fog, a place that I've talked a lot about because I've done a lot of music there over the years and whatnot. And Fog was directly pretty much across the street from the Strand. So we went there afterwards for some drinks to talk, and hang out. And everybody was into the movie, and everybody, thought it was just pretty amazing. And one of the friends I went with had never even heard of Fela Kuti before, so that was really cool. He was pretty blown away by it. And we were sitting at the bar, and then we were there for maybe 10 minutes or whatever. And I looked up, and Alex Gibney comes walking in, and I was like, holy mackerel, that's Alex Gibney. And he came up, and he was in there. He came into Fog to do the same thing that we were doing, and he had a little like entourage of people, and got some drinks. And he, walked up, and he was standing right next to me, and we made eye contact, and we started talking. We started to talk, and I said, yeah, that was an amazing movie. That was a great presentation, and I told him how much I've been following his career for a long time, and he's one of my favorite directors. And he was super cool. He was totally down to earth, and we talked for about 5 or 10 minutes, and it was pretty awesome. And he was talking about how he was really impressed with the Camden Film Festival, how it's grown, and he was saying he was in negotiations with them to have, for that following year, he was going to have a premiere of one of his films, and that he also had all these ties to Maine. He actually had a house in Owl's Head, and it was super cool. It was totally down to earth, totally disarming guy, and so that was a really fun experience. So today's show is going to be my second coverage. I did a show on All of Mankind, which was an exploration documentary on the first Apollo mission to the moon, which is that movie is totally just like a spellbinding experience. But that was my first coverage of a movie that I really love. I don't even consider it really a documentary. I feel like great documentaries are just good movies in a lot of ways, even though it is its own thing, and obviously the narrative is very different. But I look at that as just being an incredible film, and I did a show on that about a month ago. So this is going to be my second coverage of a quote unquote documentary. But I look at it at the end of the day, you know, I don't discriminate when it comes to art or music or films or anything really, because I think if it's good, no matter what genre or style, if it's good, it's good. It doesn't matter. I love films in particular that, even if they're, say, part of a franchise, but if they're like a true standalone, kind of in its own, on its own terms, you don't need to know anything about, say, if it's a sequel or prequel or this or that. It tells that story, and you are just drawn to that subject no matter what. So to me, that's for me personally, that's just an example of, like, that's what, it doesn't matter really what genre something is or isn't. It's, if it translates to you as the viewer something moving, or gives you that experience, or it takes you away for a couple hours, that's all that matters. So I just saw this documentary. It's called Moonage Daydream. It came out in 2022. It came out in September of this year. It's hard to believe it's over a year ago, and it just came out on DVD. I'd heard about this documentary, and it was directed by Brett Morgen. And I've heard about this. Well, actually, I just heard about this film maybe about a month ago, which I was really surprised. And it's a documentary all about the iconic rock star David Bowie. And I have to say that it's the best thing I've ever seen on David Bowie. It's easily one of the greatest documentaries slash, I don't know, it almost goes into like biopic territory, even though it doesn't traditionally fit into that narrative. But I was just completely blown away by it. It totally gives you this perspective on what and what is, and the genius and the legacy of who David Bowie was, and what he represented in his life, and his amazing path that he was on throughout his career. I have a pretty long history with David Bowie. For me, there's a whole long story behind kind of my connection to David Bowie. Looking back at his career and looking at him as an artist, I feel like for me personally, especially when it comes to my band Quantum, I mean, definitely as far as a musical, the impact that he's had on that band, especially with that group. But I would say it transcends even that. It's really overarching, and it reaches kind of everything, encompasses everything for me. But especially when it comes to my band Quantum, he for me, he is my greatest influence overall. Out of so many other artists and so many other things that influence that band. But for me, I have to say that David Bowie is the biggest source of inspiration for me. I have an interesting history too with how I discovered David Bowie. When I grew up, listening to bands of the 70s, or bands that I was exposed to, like bands in the 60s and 70s. Like I grew up, like a lot of kids, a lot of American kids, like I grew up listening to Led Zeppelin. I was a huge Black Sabbath fan. I still love both of those bands. All these bands I'm going to mention. Huge Black Sabbath fan, huge Led Zeppelin fan. The Doors was another band I was really, really into. And these bands were, like most American kids, like bands that I had heard on, like, the classic rock, rock stations growing up, and that was like my first exposure. That stuff was so American like apple pie. And and I remember hearing Bowie at that time too. But for some reason, I kind of gravitated towards like bands more in those lines, like Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, even Kiss, The Doors. I went through all these phases where I became obsessed, and later on, in my teens, I bought all of their albums, and I really got into them, and that was probably my exposure to rock music. What were those bands? Jimi Hendrix Experience, Band of Gypsies, all that stuff was like as far as introducing me to rock. Like most people in the world, yeah, and first hearing their songs on the radio growing up. And like I said, I got a little bit older, and then I ended up buying all the Black Sabbath albums I could find, all of the Doors albums I could find, and whatnot, and became a huge fan. And I still love those bands to this day. And I remember hearing Bowie at that time, but for some reason, I don't know what it was. It was just maybe just the timing or whatnot, but I didn't follow that same kind of path when I had heard Bowie. I had heard Bowie's stuff on classic rock stations growing up, because a lot of his stuff did get a lot of airplay. But for some reason, I didn't gravitate towards that as much as, say, Black Sabbath or Zeppelin. And it wasn't until like many, many, many years later. I was probably, I think, yeah, I was in my 20s. I was in my 20s. I was in my mid to early 20s. And I was playing in this band for a while. I was living here in Maine. I had been in Maine for, I had moved to Maine, and I had been living here in Maine for about maybe 5 years, 6 years. So I had been here for a chunk of time. I had I had a pretty decent group of friends at that point, and I was, kind of getting a little bit of a getting some traction in as far as, you know, meeting friends, and then also I slowly started playing in bands at that point, and I had a couple of steady rock bands I was playing with that time, and I was getting more familiar with the area, and I was playing in this one band for a while called the Vicky Andres Band. She's an incredibly talented woman. I have a long history with her. I played with her for about maybe 7 to 8 years at one point when I was in my early 20s. When I got out of Berkeley, a few years after that, I started playing in a few more or less steady projects. I started playing with Vicky Andres a few years after I got out of school. And that at one point was a real busy band, a real busy, pretty active rock and roll band. And then I was also playing with this jazz group that was called Fascinating Rhythm. And that band was very similar to, like, totally different genre, but it was similar to like Manhattan Transfer. And that group was like the first group that I played in that was all of a sudden this big thing, at least for me as far as exposure, because we were playing lots of gigs that were, I guess you can consider it to be kind of high profile. And we were playing at festivals, and we were playing all around Maine, and all of the gigs. I remember one of the first times, because I was so green to the whole, way of how that world operates. I remember when we had played this bigger show where there was a lot of people there, and it was like an outdoor kind of festival thing. And I remember getting my first check for it, and I was just like, oh wow, like I get paid for this. Like it was like, wow, that became at one point, that band or that group was definitely a pretty well known group in the area. We used to play at we played at a lot of different festivals, like the Lobster Festival. We played at the Camden Opera House, Rockport Opera House. We played at these big, like, summer outdoor kind of concerts. One of the biggest things that band had gotten a chance to do, which was its big claim to fame, was to play and open up for this real famous jazz group that was a pretty phenomenal, or I should say, a doo-wop group. and that was a real great experience. That group, been Fascinating Rhythm, that big break for that band, or the biggest thing that band had really accomplished, was that we got to open up for the Temptations. That was pretty wild. So when I was playing, and I was also playing with Vicky Andres, and we had recorded a few albums together over like I think about 2 or 3 albums over that span of our career. I had played with her for about 7 or 8 years, and then there was a long time where we kind of went our different ways and kind of went on a hiatus, and then probably about 3 or 4 years ago we started playing again, and it was really great. We had all this momentum kind of going, and we were starting to play a lot more shows. And at one point that was the busiest band, and then we kind of went our separate ways again. But I remember the experience of when I first really got bit by the bug of David Bowie. I was playing a show with Vicky Andres. We were playing this show at the Blue Goose, which is actually this big old dance hall right down the street. And at one point, that used to be a regular venue for events and concerts and bands, and tons of people used to go to that all the time. A couple people bought it over the years. There had changed ownership a few times, and then the prices went up, so it became pretty much impossible for people to rent out. Now it's only used for like weddings and whatnot. But at one point, that was a regular music venue, and they used to have music there on weekends, and tons of people would show up, and they'd always have these like chem-free events. But like sometimes 300 or 400 people would show up to this place, and it was a really great time. And I remember, I think it was probably the first time I played with Vicky there. We played there a handful of times over the years, and this was going back a long time ago. But we had done this one show. We were doing this one show at the Blue Goose, and we got there to set up, and we were doing all our thing about setting up all our gear, and then we did like a sound check. And Vicky had gotten a friend or something to do, or some person she knew to do, to run sound. She had hired a sound guy to do it, and it's a pretty big hall, so you need for that kind of space you need a fairly good size PA system and monitors, because it has a fairly large stage, and there was always at that point a lot of people going to that space. And I remember after we'd done sound check, there was the guy who was doing the sound, who was running sound, put on some music, to like house music, to just to play music before as people were coming in, and to just have music going. And at one point he was playing some music, and at one point he started playing this whole like huge block of David Bowie. He played his early stuff, some of his later stuff, and then all this. Basically, he played like a big playlist of all of David Bowie's stuff, and it was particularly, I remember it was kind of focused on his like earlier work. And I remember like really listening to a lot of that music, and I was just like, wow, who is that? Who is this? Like, this is amazing. I recognized a couple of the songs, and I'm like, this is like, I came away, I remember listening to the music during, after our sound check, and I was just like, this is like some of the most amazing music I've ever heard. And I'm like, I know a couple of these songs, but who is this? And I remember talking to a couple of people there, and they were like, yeah, this is all like David Bowie music. And I was just like, oh my God. And I was just totally blown away. For some reason, at that moment, at that time, I was just like enamored by what I was listening to. And that's what started. And after that point, I literally went out to find any and every David Bowie album I could possibly find. And I became like a huge, just an incredibly obsessed fan. And I tried to buy every studio album that he had. I used to be really into getting bootlegs, like live bootlegs of certain bands. I got a ton of bootlegs of his stuff, a lot of live cuts. He also did lots of B-side recordings. There was so much music that he had put out during his career, and I became obsessed with it. And my two favorite periods of Bowie, I mean, I love all of his stuff, but my favorite two periods of David Bowie was, probably Ziggy Stardust, and also when he put out the project which is known as Low, which he started to. It was during a period where he was living in Berlin, and he was doing all these extensive collaborations with the iconic Brian Eno. And at that point, in his career, he started incorporating an electronica element to his music, and the music got even more, to a degree, like experimental. Those are my two favorite periods. Probably that period, the later period, with his collaborations with Brian Eno, are probably my favorite. And I was just blown away by it. And the thing that I always think of when I think about Bowie, and when I think about the impact that his music has had on me personally, and I feel like the world, my experience around listening to some of his music was, it was very melancholy and yet hopeful, and also kind of dark at the same time. I had this I always had this experience where I could listen to certain songs of his or certain albums. Hunky Dory, geez, so many great, incredible albums. I could listen to certain songs of his, and I went through a phase where I was listening to him like every day, like just obsessed. I was an obsessive listener to Bowie, and I found where I could listen to a song and say if I was in, say, a really good mood or in a good happy space, that particular song I would feel like was reflected in that song or that piece. And in that same song, I would listen to it the next day, and I might not be in that kind of a positive place. I might be in a somber mood, or even kind of in a darker mood, or in a very melancholy headspace. And I felt like all his music, I could every time I would listen to his songs or his albums, it could apply to any of those situations. It could apply to whether I was feeling incredibly sad or whether I was feeling incredibly happy or just melancholy. It felt like his music transcended all of that, of where it always meant something different. And I had this experience every time when I would listen to his music, that it always made me think differently, and it always had all these different shades, and it always reflected whatever mood I was in. And so I found myself, when I was listening to his music and his songs, I was always getting these different interpretations of what he was and what his music was the meaning it was giving me. And I never really had that. And even to this day, I don't really have that intense reaction to music where, I might listen to, say, a particular band or a particular song because I'm in a certain state of mind, and every time I listen to that song or band, that same kind of emotion reemerges, and it's that same kind of feeling, and it's fulfilling in its own kind of collective way. But with Bowie, I found that it was totally opposite. It was always fulfilling and incredibly satisfying, but emotionally, I was always, I could apply his music all the time to however I was feeling, and every time I listened to a song or an album, I would get something different from it, and it could be, something that could reflect any of those emotions. And it was such a unique experience. I've never really had that experience with an artist or band since then. And I definitely, at that point, never had that experience. And I feel it was really due to his ability to, I think with David Bowie, his whole mode of operation was that of being a chameleon, and the process of reinventing himself, and never this I feel like as an artist he had this restless nature to what he was doing, but yet it was all a pure, like, celebration of the life experience. and taking on as many, for him, I think, as an artist, taking on as many influences as he could, and also being influenced by things that were not necessarily music, but things from literature, things from film, things from various philosophies. And he was, I feel like, a real explorer. And all of those things that he was so inspired by, and all the different facets of media and culture reflected in his music. And I feel like that attributed to him always reinventing himself. So, and he was obviously, David Bowie is a pop star, but he was not a pop star until later, much later into his career. He financially and his album, and like as far as sales of his albums, like he was always kind of struggling. He was never really a pop star for a long time. Ziggy Stardust and a lot of his early albums were not hits by any means. By that point, it wasn't until like the late '70s or even the '80s, mid to late '80s, when he started to become more popular, and suddenly he was playing these venues where he was adored by millions of fans, and he became more of a celebrity. But he was doing music for so long, and he was just doing his thing, and a lot of critics, a lot of even fans were just, they didn't know what to think of him, and he commercially was never a viable entity until later into his career. And the thing that I take away personally, and again, this is like attributed to my deep appreciation from him as far as being an artist and a songwriter. I always feel like as a writer, he never told you, or you can never. I feel like if David Bowie wrote, say, a quote unquote love song, like a breakup song, or a song of where a song about, say, his dog dying, or his house burning down, for instance, he always had this ambiguity to his writing. He always had this obvious androgynous uh, aesthetic. He was always playing with boundaries. He was always playing with rules and people's perceptions. And the thing that I loved about him the most was there could be a song that you might think, okay, this is like, maybe it's a love song that he's written, but then you listen to it again, and it could be, no, maybe it's not that. Maybe it's about just him being really philosophical, or maybe he is going through a tough time here, or maybe he's in this really gray area. As a singer and a writer, he never, I think, never wrote a song that where it was so obvious as to what that song was about. There's always an air of mystery, and I feel like as a listener, it always pulled me in more because he never was wearing his heart on his sleeve as far as maybe what the content of what he was creating was about. It was always ambiguous, even though I think on his own terms, from probably his perspective, it was deeply personal, and it might have been about very specific things, or a very specific subject matter. You couldn't really tell as the audience. So because he never wore that thing as a flag or as a banner, or he never wore his heart on his sleeve, so it was obvious that this song was about this very specific thing. It could mean many things. It was very ambiguous. It was mysterious. And he did that with everything, with incorporating influences from various philosophies, and also sexual genders, and also his background in theater. Um, I always feel like if you have, like, there's a lot of singer songwriters that I've seen over the years, people that I've seen locally, and then there's also obvious singers and bands out there that are nationally known or worldwide known, or you might see them go on stage and they might introduce a song saying okay, or you can just tell really, or you can tell right away at face value that, oh, this is a love song, this is a breakup song, or this is about, I lost my job today, or blah blah blah. And it's like very very obvious as far as the narrative goes what that song is about and what the story is behind it. And I feel like Bowie never did that. He always had a level of where it was ambiguous, and it left the whole thing up into interpretation. And I love, like there's a time and place for everything. If a song, if it's good, it's good. If it moves you, it moves you. It doesn't matter. But I gravitate towards, like, I'd rather hear a song that might be about love, but it's not obvious, or a song about darkness, but it's not obvious. It has different shades. It has different voices within the presentation, and it can mean lots of different things. But it leaves the audience to kind of make up their own minds or to get their own experience, based on your individual experience, and it can mean different things to you in different phases in your life or whatnot. And 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 I feel like, to me, that is the, I guess, the thing that I love the most about him. And for, like, me personally, um, when it comes to, like, say, Quantum, and like the biggest influence I had was on the narrative of how I would present a song. That was like that's Bowie's biggest influence on me. Whereas, like, for me, and it's a strange thing, but, like, for me, if I'm writing music, say for Quantum, or music that I've written, on one hand, it could, it might be something very very specific, and I feel like that music, for me, for what it's worth, yeah, it's kind of silly and goofy and a little bit weird, but there's aspects of that music for me that I write is it could be, or there are examples of that, where a song is about a very specific thing that I'm going through, or it could be about a very specific um, range of emotion that I'm going through. But when I'm writing that song, I never want it to be black and white. I never, when it comes to creating a song, but especially around lyrics, I never want it to be that setting, or put in that setting of where, okay, this is a love song, or this is a, this is about this specific thing. I much rather have it where it's ambiguous, and where it can be open to interpretation, and not really, to a degree, be preachy, but I don't want it to be bold in its own statement about what the song is going to be about. I want it to be something that, maybe five people hear that particular song, and if they like it, they might not like it, or they do like it. They could have their own experience with it. To them, it could mean many different things. It's not going to be like, oh, okay, universally, oh, this song is about this particular thing. This is about, a divorce, or whatever. I want it to try to, hopefully, even though for me as the writer, it can be about a very specific thing, I'd rather have it to where opened enough to where that the audience, or the people listening, can have their own individual experience, and it can mean something totally different, and it gives you a sense of, it has an ambiguous nature to it. And for me as a writer, that's totally taken from David Bowie. Like, to me, that's the biggest influence, and that's the thing I've always loved about his music, and why he's had the biggest impact on me, um, musically and personally. And his sense of, obviously, the theatrical flair of his performances, of where he's going to give the audience something that is going to be a little bit of a spectacle, where he's going to take people on a journey. It's never going to be a situation where it's just going to be four dudes or four gals getting on stage with a couple amps and guitars and just playing. That can be great and awesome, and I love that. But his approach was always about taking you on a to a degree a cinematic journey. Giving you something visual that you have never seen before, and incorporating to a degree like a multimedia kind of thing within that, like rock performance. With his extensive theater background, he was on Broadway. He was also an incredible actor. And that's another thing that has always been a huge influence on me as far as with Quantum, where I never really wanted it to be presented in a way of where it's like, I guess, traditional to a sense, in a sense of where it's just a couple of guys on stage in their jeans and t-shirts and they're just plugging in and playing their music. I'd rather have a whole like kind of presentation to a degree of where it's a visual thing too, along with the music, and it, you know, creates a vibe or like kind of a ritualistic environment. And again, that's a huge and another thing that I attribute from taking a huge inspiration from David Bowie, because he was always, you never, every album was so different. He never stood still. He was always creating these new personas. He was a character. And I feel like with music too, it's the same thing. Again, yet another influence is that, you know, it has, hopefully has a theatrical flair to it, the performances, but essentially we're characters on stage. We're not there to be ourselves. We're there to express ourselves, but we're there to kind of create a different persona when we're performing. And, you know, to hopefully, if people dig it, maybe they don't like it or whatever, but if they do dig it, it can give you that sense of where it takes you out of the mundane, and it's maybe a unique kind of experience. And that's really all that I try to strive for. And again, that's totally attributed to David Bowie. Um, and like again, I said he did so many things. He was on Broadway. He had an extensive acting background. He's also been in some incredible movies. He was in a movie called Basquiat about the famous New York artist, and he played Andy Warhol in that film. Just amazing, one of his best roles. He was also in another film, Christopher Nolan film called The Prestige, which is just amazing. He plays Nikolai Tesla. And then, of course, everyone knows Labyrinth. I mean, iconic 80s movie that, every kid was raised on. Just, an amazing film. He had such a diverse background, and he was also an incredible visual artist. This documentary, Moonage Daydream, does such an incredible job with showing all of this footage, a lot of live footage, and a lot of interviews with him that I had never seen before, that were never released. And it really goes into his whole like his basic like bedrock of his philosophy, and how he was so restless and creative all at the same time, but yet he just enjoyed life so much. And he truly took that aspect of that kind of thing of where variety is the spice of life, and turned it up to 11. And he also always like pushed boundaries. He was never working in forms of like, say, traditional convention. Even in his later period, where he was kind of considered a pop star, he always messed with convention. He always kind of, always was slightly or completely outside of the box of what maybe somebody would traditionally do in that space. He was always pushing those boundaries and always creatively thinking ways around tradition. But yet his stuff was incredibly structured, and he kind of invented his own rules to a degree. But then he would cast them away by the time the next album would come out, because he was on to the next thing. And I feel like with his music, you listen to it. I mean, obviously you listen to certain groups or bands from that period, sometimes there's like a dated quality to it where you can tell, oh, right away that's definitely 70s, or that's 1965, and his music still has that quality. But for me, he was always thinking about what was going on at that time in culture and in music, and history for that matter, and philosophy. He was always steeped in that, in like where his I feel like his hand was on that pulse of where culture was at that time, and where we were as a society. But then at the same time, he was always, at least 10, 15 years ahead of that. He was always, I feel like in a lot of ways, he was a true, not only the true definition of an artist, but he was a futurist. He was always doing things on two levels. Like, he was so aware of what was happening culturally in that given moment, whether it was through fashion, through architecture, whether it was through the visual arts, theater, film, music, and then the general, and well steeped in various forms of philosophy, and also also steeped in that of where the climate was socially in that society at that given time. He was always aware of that. I feel in every step that he took. But then at the same time, like I said, I feel I looked at him as being this futurist to a degree. He was always looking towards the next thing, 10 or 15 years ahead. So I feel like his music, because of his philosophy, had this incredible has this incredible level of where it's timeless, and it transcends what period that respected album or song came out at that time. It feels like it came out, in 2022, and yet it's got that flair from maybe from the 60s or 70s, but it still transcends that because it just feels fresh and new and exciting and provoking. Yeah, just just amazing. And one of the most intense experiences I had at one point, which was so sad at one point. I remember, like, during this period, I was a huge, listening to Bowie all the time, and I remember one morning I was I was up early or something. I couldn't really sleep very well, and I remember I had to work that day, and I remember getting up in the morning, and I turned on the news, and I couldn't get to sleep, and then I was like, oh, I'll just stay up for a while, and I made a cup of coffee or something, and I sat on my couch. At that time, I had cable. It was like 2016. Yeah, about 7 or 8 years ago. I was sitting on my couch, and I put on the on TV, and the Today Show came on, and it was super early in the morning. It was like 5:30 in the morning or something ridiculous. And the first thing I saw when I turned on the tube was David Bowie dies, or David Bowie was dead. And I remember just being like, holy shit. I was, my jaw dropped, and I was just so sad. I couldn't believe it. I was shocked. He was in the midst of being, I mean, he was such an incredible, he was so prolific as a writer, but he was in the midst of doing two albums, like back to back, two or three albums, and he was, you know, um, this one album he had just come out with, which was a great album. I was listening to that one album in particular, and there was talk about him doing this other album called the Black Star, and so he was like in this prolific stage, and he was I think he was starting to tour again. He was starting to play some shows. He had some health issues like a few years previous, but he was still like really vibrant and healthy. No, I had no indication that anything had happened to him. And he died of cancer, and I remember just being totally shocked and devastated. And I used to, at that point, up until that point, I literally listened to David Bowie in some form or another every day. It was like a regular daily ritual. I listened to some form of his music, one of his songs or one of his albums every day. And I remember being so shocked and sad by that news that I stopped listening to his music, and I only just recently started listening to his music again. It's I couldn't listen. I couldn't listen to any of his music for a few years afterwards because it would just get me so upset that he was dead. It was really weird. I've never had that experience with any other band before, or artist, or or like filmmaker for that instance. Yeah, and you know, and then just the last few months, I've been listening to his music again, and this watching his documentary, Moonage Daydream, is just astounding, and it's just a complete and utter celebration of his life. I love that the way this documentary is put together. It just has this wonderful narrative. Like, it really shows. I feel like how Bowie's brain uh, explored ideas in a visual sense, and a myriad of different emotions, and and so many influences that he was that were always filling his cup for inspiration. Like, this documentary really shows, I feel like, how he functioned as a human being and as a true artist. It's the only way I can describe this documentary is it's pure electric. It's astounding. Uh, Definitely the best thing I've ever seen on Bowie. I've seen a few documentaries on him, but this is easily the best, if not the best documentary I've seen, and now or ever. It's pure electric, but it really gives you a sense of how, like, this was, like, even the editing and the use of music and the way they use the visual aspect in this film. It gives you this, like, the total, like, immersive experience of, like, how I feel Bowie operated as an artist. Like, everything about it, it's like you're in his you're completely in his world, and you're in you're looking through the world through his lens, and that's the biggest part of this documentary. I highly recommend it. It's just incredible, just incredible. It's definitely the greatest doc I've seen on uh, David Bowie, and for that matter, probably, the greatest, if not one of the greatest documentaries I've ever seen. Moonage Daydream. It came out in 2022. I highly, highly recommend it. It just came out on video. I think it's been streaming for quite a while, but I just saw it last night for the first time. Amazing. So this is Jason Dean, and if you get a chance, please like and subscribe to my channel. I appreciate all the love and support. And we'll see you next time. Have a wonderful day. Peace.